Southeast Asia?
I'm very, first and foremost, I'm very thankful to Professor Arvind for giving me an opportunity to present in this. When I'm sitting in a panel like this with such eminent people and also speaking in front of such good people, I can remember the phrase which the Indonesian foreign minister used to describe Singapore, called it the little red dot on the map. So in such a big presence, I might be the little red dot, but I'll try to make my best in terms of conveying my idea of what I think about the strategic significance of strategic interests of India in Southeast Asia. I'd first like to put out, if culture, for instance, and cultural influence were the only measure for us to look at India in Southeast Asia, India would be regarded as the superpower. But, however, we in international relations tend to look at the world system and with influence, power, and interest. And in this case, it becomes an imperative for us to understand how strategic interests and what are our strategic interests and what we should look at in a particular region, especially in this case, Southeast Asia. This will be a agenda which I'll be following throughout this presentation. I'll be looking at the emerging regional security environment first in Southeast Asia and look at Southeast Asia and India's strategic calculus. Then the transition from our lookies to acties policy and try to figure out what that actually signifies. And the impact of extra-regional power influence on India's policy options is something that I'll be very keen to look at. And the emerging strategic interest areas in Southeast Asia for India, and I'll go on to the conclusion. In Southeast Asia, over the years, especially from 2012, when the ASEAN grouping was unable to reach a consensus on an issue of South China Sea, Southeast Asia, the ASEAN grouping had started to be questioned on this whole idea of solidarity and being a very strong grouping. Now, this in turn is also a part of the shifting policies of major powers towards this particular region. If we are very much aware of the US rebalance strategy, which Southeast Asia is a very integral part. And China, obviously, we have heard many speakers speak about the maritime Silk Route. And again, as it was emphasized yesterday, that China considers Southeast Asia as a very integral part of the maritime Silk Route project. And again, countries like Japan, who are trying to again play a very proactive role in this particular region, have focused their attention in aiding countries such as the Philippines, for example, who are embroiled in a dispute in the South China Sea with China. And India, obviously, with this policy change, has indicated that it's going to renew more focus on Southeast Asia. Now, Southeast Asia is important for a number of reasons, and more importantly for its geopolitical features. And one of the most important is the sea lanes of communication. As we are aware that the flow of resources, especially oil and natural gas, flow from West Asia to East Asia, and the goods and trade is the reverse route. So these sea lanes of communication do not only pertain to one particular product or commodity, but they need to be secured to secure trade as well as resource security. And disputes with major powers, as I highlighted starting this slide, that the dispute with major powers, ASEAN countries are seen to be trapped between this. And non-disputed countries, for example, in the South China Sea dispute, also become a part of this, as the members who are in the dispute have tried to engage try to take ASEAN as the part to dealing with China. Now, what is the future of ASEAN? Again, that has been questioned, and new geopolitical constructs. We have mentioned the Indo-Pacific, and countries in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, play a very important role, and that has been manifested in their ambitions to display some sort of intent towards playing a major role in the Indo-Pacific construct. This is a map. As it was discussed in the last presentation, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership both have brought about a scenario where it's almost in a say that there are two competing regional trade routes. And in between you have the South China Sea dispute, and obviously that's the main sea line of communication in the Strait of Malacca. Now, where does Southeast Asia fit in India's strategic calculus? in a post-Cold War foreign policy, our thrust areas have been obviously energy security, increasing our strategic role in various regions around the world, and looking at multilateral organizations through which we can promote trade. And also, it was in the fall of the Soviet Union that we needed to have a thaw with the West. So, in all these factors, Southeast Asia actually figured. And in the geopolitical factors, obviously, Southeast Asia, as we historically know, also has been a natural expansion of India's strategic space. And it has been our natural sphere of influence, which we should not negate, and we should try to build on. And obviously, when we talk about a rising India, we come back to the idea of securing sea lanes of communication and our economic interest with ASEAN. And the emerging role of the Asia-Pacific trade and security architecture, where India will be a key country to play a very big role. And India's changing intent towards its neighborhood, obviously we have seen that the focus is now on South Asia, but we have also seen renewed efforts to increase communication with countries in Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam, which has been a very key time-tested partner for India. And obviously Southeast Asian countries, as we know, the regional comprehensive economic partnership, Asian countries, especially ASEAN, is playing a very key role. And that gives more impetus for India to deal with this region. Now, speaking about the transition from Look East to Act East, the opportunities for India are tremendous in this particular region. And the foreign policy priorities, obviously, as I had mentioned, historical and cultural significance for India in this particular region has always been there. And it was seen as a way to thaw relations with the West after the Cold War. And the transition has been from a region from which India dealt with for a strategic necessity. In 2012, India has become a strategic partner for ASEAN after the India-ASEAN Summit, which was held to commemorate 2 decades of relations between India and ASEAN. This transformation is acknowledgement of India's role in Southeast Asia as a key power. And India is part of the emerging solution for ASEAN. As it can be highlighted again, India does not carry a baggage, any historical baggage of any dispute with Southeast Asian countries. That's a positive side which India should emphasize on in our relations. And renewed focus in strengthening our relations with strategic partners, it's very important to note that there have been key countries within Southeast Asia, and we are actually capitalizing on increasing our relations in ASEAN through those countries. They have been Singapore, Vietnam, Myanmar is emerging, and of course Thailand, as we have heard in the last presentation, has been very instrumental in sub-regional initiatives such as those. Now, when we study the history of Southeast Asia, it becomes, we cannot avoid or negate the factor of extra-regional powers playing an important role in shaping the regional security in the particular region. Now, how has been China's approach towards Southeast Asia? China has been, even though China has been economic and diplomatic, has pushed economic and diplomatically in Southeast Asia. For example, ASEAN's investment in China is at the tune of $1.2 trillion, and the reverse from China to ASEAN is around $800 billion. So there has been some sort of a transaction and the growth in economic relations. But again, we have China asserting on what it calls its core interest. Namely, one of the core interests for China is the South China Sea dispute. So there is this complex medley between China over security and trade. And of course, the US approach to Southeast Asia, it was recalibrating its strategy towards this particular region and devising an alternative order in the region to maintain its leadership position. We have to not to forget that the US Navy is still is the strongest navy in this particular region. And obviously, these policies of countries have had convergences and divergences with India. For example, as it was highlighted yesterday on the session on the talk on China, that China has actually become very important for India for its economic growth. Similarly, the ASEAN region is also very important. But in the security sense, India has a dispute with China. So and a strategic rivalry with China. So this plays out in this complex scenario. And India's approach towards major power policy in Southeast Asia, obviously being a plank of our foreign policy, strategic autonomy is something that India will never abandon. And hence it has resorted to balancing between these major powers. Now, quickly coming to the emerging strategic interest areas for India in Southeast Asia, the partnership with Vietnam, as I said, has been time tested. India has provided a line of credit for Vietnam to purchase military equipment, where at the same time it has also provided a line of credit for trade. So this, in sense, you can see that India is trying to balance its relations. And with Myanmar, for example, which is the relationship we can say is in the making. As Myanmar has opened up from, is slowly transcending towards democracy, the question we should be asking is that how India at this particular moment, when the feeling against China in Myanmar is not so favorable, how India can capitalize on this particular interest. There have been instances where a country like Myanmar has been able to say no to China. And in this case, this signals the arrival of Myanmar and it being playing a very proactive role in the geopolitics, emerging geopolitics between South and Southeast Asia. And obviously, as I have been explaining, that the security of sea lanes and other maritime waterways is very important. And there's a converging interest with regional powers. As it was highlighted, President Joko Widodo, who is known as Jokowi in Indonesia, has actually very clearly stated that his intention is to make Indonesia a rising maritime power again. So this in turn can be helpful for countries like India, where in promoting policies which can link our two regions together. India has always said that it needs to build, it wants to build a cooperative security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region. That has been changing to an interest-based dynamic regional building. Why I say interest-based? Because over the years, with the new government coming in, there has been close engagement with the United States, Australia, and Japan, which has been seen at the various forums and summits which the leaders of these countries have met. But there has also been selective engagement with China. Then this sort of a perception of how we particularly deal with major powers is actually also how Southeast Asian countries will perceive India and on which side India stands with this particular region. And that becomes a very important factor that we should know. And one of the other key areas which India can consider is emerging strategic area is India having the similar technology with many countries in terms of defense. India has been helping in capacity building in Vietnam, in Indonesia and Malaysia. Increasing this strategic footprint in Southeast Asia will become a very important thing. And possibly there would be a chance in the future that India might, due to its changing policies with other major powers, India might be able to extend this sort of assistance to other countries in the region. In conclusion, I'd like to say that India is learning to work with multiple powers in the international system. And it is in this context that India has been able to develop a bilateral understanding with a number of Southeast Asian countries. Building multiple channels of cooperation through strong sub-regional partnerships is and what is interesting is that we see that these countries are key countries in this particular sub-regions of Southeast Asia. If we take Myanmar, it is a neighbor of India, so it can be dealt with separately. If we take Vietnam, it is the strongest country in Indochina. And if we take Singapore and Indonesia, they are obviously in maritime Southeast Asia, the strongest of the countries, particularly there. So building multiple channels of cooperation and dealing through these countries which have had favorable relations with India is one particular aspect which India can look at. And increasing strategic footprint, obviously pursuing close defense ties is something that irritates China most often, especially how India makes statements over the South China Sea. We have seen how China reacts. So, and pursuing close defense ties with countries like Vietnam is for obviously a strategic benefit for India. And sub-regional cooperation such as BIMSTEC are bridges between two regions, South and Southeast Asia. So building this sort of cooperation will help bridge India's policy towards Southeast Asia. And an assertive policy in Southeast Asia is something that India should have. And securing India's interests vis-a-vis other powers in how India maneuvers in this particular region. And for example, like I said, voicing its concern over something like the South China Sea irritates China. And that, in a way, is also a position of assertion which India puts across. And tapping the economic potential is something very important in ASEAN. The combined economic power of this particular region is almost $2 trillion, a little more than $2 trillion. So this is a benefit for India. And India, contentious issues set apart, India and ASEAN had took a really long time to sign the free trade agreement. And some of the issues in the trade in goods agreement was related to agricultural products, which were the stumbling blocks. And like it was highlighted by the previous speaker, our strength remains in our services sector. So harnessing the services sector in ASEAN is something that India can very strongly look at. Just to conclude, I had come across a survey which was taken in terms of how it's a survey called about the Global Attitude Survey. And that basically on a section which speaks about how Asians view each other. It's very interesting to see that in the Philippines, in Japan and in Indonesia, for example, let's take the Philippines and Indonesia being in Southeast Asia, how they perceive China due to their disputes, almost 90% and 62% of the participants felt that China and the dispute over the South China Sea is very dangerous for their country. But how they comparatively view India and China is something very interesting. Except Indonesia, where between India and China, how they view India and China was almost, say, China was 66% favorable and India 62%. Whereas in the Philippines, China was viewed almost at 38% favorable, and in India was viewed almost 50%. But it was even better in Vietnam, where China was viewed almost 16% to be favorable, and whereas India was viewed 67%. So attitudes in Southeast Asia and in the people in Southeast Asia is changing towards these two countries. And that should also be capitalized by India. Thank you very much.